My name is Claire Ashworth, and I'm 35 years old. It happened at Christmas dinner, the moment my mother raised her glass, scanned the table for every uncle and cousin she could find, and announced that my sister had just closed on her dream home. Then she turned toward me with that gentle, rehearsed expression she saves for moments like this, and said the family portrait still had an empty frame waiting on me. My sister grinned into her wine glass and asked, in front of everyone, when I planned on finally growing up. Every face at that table turned to look at me the way you'd look at an overdue library book. None of them knew that I'd spent over a decade quietly building a life they had never once bothered to visit, and that a plain manila folder tucked inside my coat held a secret my mother had spent 11 years praying would never surface at that table. Welcome back to Quiet Reckonings, where the person everyone underestimated is usually the one holding the receipts, and where the people who spent years looking past her finally have no choice but to look straight at her. If you love stories about earned respect and boundaries that are long overdue, drop a comment and subscribe so you never miss the moment the whole room falls silent. Now let me walk you through how we got there. The morning of that dinner began the way all my mornings begin, at 4:15, in a kitchen that smells like proofing dough and cold metal. I own a place called Millstone Bakery and Orchard, a converted grain barn at the end of a dirt lane, with 26 acres of apple trees stretching out behind it. I rise before the sun because dough doesn't negotiate with exhaustion, and somewhere along the way I discovered I liked things that didn't need to be managed, only tended, patiently, season after season. My husband, Marcus, was already out in the equipment shed rehanging a door that had come off its track, and I could hear the rhythm of his drill under the low hum of the mixers. We had 14 wholesale orders due and a market booth to stock by 7. None of it was glamorous. All of it was mine, every plank, every invoice, every dollar. Somewhere in those years I picked up a habit that quietly reshaped my whole life. I stopped correcting people who'd already made up their minds about me. It spared me a lot of arguments. It also, I'd later realize, cost me something I didn't notice until it was almost too late, because staying quiet is its own kind of consent, and I had been handing that consent out for years without knowing it. My family believed I sold banana bread out of a folding table on weekends. They believed I was aimless, unmarried, still finding myself, the daughter who took a wrong turn and never found her way back to the main road. I let them believe it. Standing in that warm kitchen with flour dusted up to my elbows, I never quite figured out why I kept the best parts of my life sealed away from the very people who were supposed to want to see them. The invitation arrived exactly the way my mother's invitations always do, dressed in warmth, with a hook buried underneath. She called on a Wednesday, voice bright as a wind chime. "Everyone's coming for Christmas, sweetheart. Your sister has some wonderful news, and it just wouldn't feel right without you here." I stood beside the walk-in cooler and let the pause stretch a beat too long, because I already knew what wonderful news meant. It meant a spotlight, and it meant I'd be the folding chair brought up from the basement to fill out the room. "I'll think about it," I said. "Don't be that way," she replied. "Family is family." When I hung up, Marcus was leaning in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee, having heard just enough. "You don't have to go," he said, handing me one and waiting the way he always does, without pushing. "I know," I said. "But if I skip it, she gets to tell everyone I couldn't be bothered. If I show up, she gets to tell everyone I'm still a mess. There's no version of this where I come out ahead." Marcus thought about that. "Then go if you want," he said finally. "Just don't hand them a reason to cut you." I turned that over the rest of the day. I could attend and still keep the door to my real life shut tight. I could smile, eat the turkey, admire the big announcement, and drive home to my own bed without anyone seeing a single true thing about me. I'd made peace with invisibility years ago. So I said yes, and told myself it would be just like every other year, a few hours of playing the cautionary tale, then blessed quiet. I had no idea the script was about to rewrite itself in my hands. That dinner didn't come out of nowhere. It was the final chapter of a story my family had been telling about me for almost 3 decades. I'm the younger daughter, 4 years behind my sister, Renata. Somewhere in my first 10 years, the family settled on its verdict. Renata was the reliable one, I was the dreamer, and in my mother's mouth, dreamer was never a kind word. When I was 19 and told my parents I wanted to open a bakery, my mother laughed, not meanly, just certainly, the way you'd laugh at a child announcing she wanted to be an astronaut. That's a nice hobby, she said. Not a future. My father folded his napkin and said nothing, which was essentially his entire role whenever my mother spoke. Renata went to the state university, married a man named Preston with an impressive title at an even more impressive company, and did everything in the tidy sequence my mother had mapped out for her. I went to work at a produce stand for minimum wage and learned to laminate pastry dough well enough that people drove an hour out of their way for it. Even then, I noticed that money in our family only ever flowed in one direction. There was always cash for Renata's tuition, Renata's wedding, Renata's security deposit. For me, there was advice, plenty of it, and a gentle reminder that I'd made my own choices. I stopped asking my parents for anything while I was still young. I told myself that was pride. Looking back, it was self-preservation, because asking and being turned down had started to feel like paying money to be reminded of my place in line. So I built quietly, one pre-dawn shift at a time, and let my mother keep her tidy little narrative. I just didn't yet understand how expensive that narrative had become for everyone. The last time I ever asked my mother for help, I was 22, and I'd done my homework. I'd found a vacant storefront downtown, cheap because the roof leaked, and I'd built an actual business plan, projected costs, a repayment timeline I'd triple-checked. The bank would lend to me, but only with a cosigner, since I was young and my credit history was thin. So I sat across from my mother at her kitchen table and laid it all out, careful and complete, the way you present something you've genuinely bled over. She read it. She actually read every page, which gave me almost 90 seconds of hope. Then she slid the folder back across the table and folded her hands. "We only have room to believe in one of you," she said. That was the entire verdict. Not "we can't afford it." Not "the numbers worry me." Not "let me talk to your father." Just, "we only have room to believe in one of you." I remember the clock ticking on her wall. I remember the smell of her coffee going cold. I remember deciding, right there, that I would never again bring my dreams into a room where they could be appraised and rejected like a used car. I didn't argue. Arguing would have meant I still believed the verdict was up for appeal. Instead, I took a loan from a community lender at a punishing rate, and I picked up overnight cleaning shifts at an office park to cover the payments. I signed that first lease alone, and for a decade, every time the work got brutal, her sentence played on a loop in my head. "We only have room to believe in one of you." For years I assumed it was cruelty. It turned out to be a spreadsheet. There was exactly one person in my family who never once made me feel like a losing bet: my grandmother, Vivian. She was my father's mother, sharp-eyed, with a vegetable garden that fed half the block, and she had strong opinions about everything except my choices, which she simply trusted without asking why. The first week I ran my little roadside stand, she drove out in her enormous old sedan, bought the first loaf I ever sold, and paid me $1 more than I'd asked, insisting I'd undercharged. Then she sat on an overturned bucket and watched me work for an hour without saying much. When she finally stood to leave, she pressed her dry, warm palm to my cheek and gave me the only piece of business advice I've ever actually kept. "Build it quiet, honey," she said. "Loud people need an audience. Builders just need mornings." I didn't fully understand that then. I understood it years later, every time I watched my sister perform her life for a crowd while I got up in the dark and simply lived mine. Vivian died 5 years ago, peacefully, in the house she'd paid off on a school secretary's salary. She didn't leave me money, and I never wanted any. What she left me was that sentence, and a way of seeing the world I couldn't unlearn. At her funeral, my mother cried the loudest and stood closest to the casket, and I remember thinking Vivian would have found that exactly fitting. Renata's wedding, 12 years ago, is the clearest snapshot I have of how our family did arithmetic. She married Preston in a rented ballroom with a crystal chandelier, 300 guests, and a cake that cost more than my first 4 months of rent combined. My mother planned it like a coronation and never once used the word budget. I was a bridesmaid in a dress I genuinely couldn't afford, standing at the front, watching my mother glow like she'd finally been handed the daughter the universe owed her. I want to be clear, I loved my sister then, in that complicated way you love someone who has always been given the better chair before you've even entered the room. Renata wasn't a villain. She was simply a person who had never once been told no, And people like that develop a peculiar blindness to the size of the platform they're standing on. Over the years she got comfortable with quiet loans that never got mentioned again, a vacation our parents just wanted to treat them to, and a habit of narrating her own life in updates designed to be admired. So when my mother said Renata had big news for Christmas, I could already picture the whole scene, photos passed hand to hand, gasps on cue, a toast. I assumed it would be the house. Renata had spent weeks hinting online about manifesting our forever home, which is the sort of phrase that makes me want to go start a sourdough starter just to have something honest to do with my hands. What I couldn't have guessed on the drive to that dinner was that the dream house wasn't the flex it appeared to be. It was a det wearing a bow, and I was about to learn exactly whose name was underneath the ribbon. By that December, I had a life I was genuinely proud of, and almost none of my family had seen so much as a square foot of it. I owned my building outright. I owned the orchard and farmhouse. The final note paid off that spring. I employed 8 people, held wholesale contracts with 3 regional grocers, and was married to a man who fixed things instead of breaking them. On paper, I was the most financially stable person in my entire family. In my family's mythology, I was the one who never quite landed. I've thought a lot about my own part in that gap, because I want to be honest about it. I didn't hide my life out of shame. I hid it because every single time I let them close, they found some new way to make me feel smaller, so eventually it became easier just to shut the door and keep it shut. If I have a real flaw here, it isn't that I trusted them too much. It's that I stopped trusting them entirely and started calling that peace. So I planned that dinner the way I plan everything, carefully. I'd bring 2 pies. I'd smile. I'd admire the new house. I would not perform my own success, because performance is my sister's language, not mine, and I had nothing left to prove to a jury that had already delivered its verdict years ago. One evening, one polite smile, then home. That was the entire strategy. What I didn't know while loading those pies into the truck was that my father had driven out to my bakery 2 days earlier and left something on my counter, a folder I hadn't opened yet, and that everything inside it was about to end that carefully guarded peace, whether I wanted it to or not. People love stories where someone gets rich overnight. Mine is not that story. Mine took 13 years, and most of them were unremarkable, which is exactly the part nobody puts in a highlight reel. First came the roadside stand, then the storefront I signed for a loan at 22, the one with the leaking roof I patched myself between customers. I lived above the shop for a while, in 2 rooms that permanently smelled of cinnamon, funneling every spare dollar back into the business instead of into any semblance of a personal life. At 27, I bought the farmhouse and the orchard from an elderly couple retiring to the coast, at a price that only made sense because the property was falling apart. I repaired it room by room, winter by winter, and grew the orchard from bare root saplings that took years before they gave me a single apple. The wholesale contracts came one grocer at a time, each one requiring months of flawless, on-time delivery before they'd trust me with a real order. There were seasons I didn't draw a paycheck. There was a hailstorm that flattened an entire summer's harvest, and a walk-in cooler that failed on the single hottest weekend of the year. I kept meticulous books, because Vivian had been a school secretary who balanced budgets for fun, and I'd inherited her conviction that numbers never lie unless you ask them the wrong question. And the previous spring, in the plainest moment of my adult life, I sat at my own kitchen table and wrote the final check on the property. No party. No announcement. I mailed it and went back to work. That was the fortune my family never saw, because I never once invited them to look. Marcus came into my life the way most good things do, through work. He's a carpenter, and I hired him 4 years ago to reframe a sagging roof on the equipment shed. He showed up on time, did exactly what he said he'd do, charged me fairly, and noticed the same details I noticed, which is rarer than people think. We married in my backyard 2 summers ago, under the oldest tree on the property, with 9 people in attendance. A judge who was also a regular Saturday customer, 2 of my employees, Marcus's brother and his wife, and my friend Odette, who'd lent me a stand mixer in year 2 and never once let me forget it. I didn't invite my family. People have asked me why more than once since then, and the honest answer isn't dramatic. I didn't hide Marcus from anyone. I simply stopped inviting people to laugh at things that mattered to me. I knew exactly how the news would land in my mother's kitchen, the raised eyebrow, the "well, isn't that sudden?" The questions about what Marcus did that were really questions about what Marcus earned. I had built one clean, happy thing, and I couldn't bear the thought of handing it over to be appraised and found lacking, the way everything else of mine always was. So we stood under that tree. We ate pie I'd baked that same morning instead of cutting into a towering cake. And it was the best day of my adult life precisely because not one person in it had ever made me feel like a long shot. My family found out I was married months later, through a cousin. My mother's reaction, relayed secondhand, was that she was hurt to have been excluded. She had never once asked to be included. Renata called me the week before Christmas, which she never does, and the strangeness of it put me on alert before she'd even finished saying hello. She was unusually breezy, asking how I'd been, another thing she never does, before circling, gently, toward the real question, the way you circle something you don't want to look like you're grabbing at. So how's the little bakery doing these days? She asked. Still busy. You must clear a decent amount around the holidays. I gave her nothing real, just we keep busy, and kept stirring the soup on my stove while she fished. It's just so smart, what you do, she went on, in a voice that had never once described my work as smart before. Steady. No big overhead, not like some people have. She laughed a little on that last part, and something in the sound caught. My sister had never in her life asked a genuinely curious question about my business. Now she was asking, the way you check the couch cushions for loose change. I didn't understand the shape of it yet, but I understood the temperature shift. Somebody in my family was taking my measure, and people in my family only bothered doing math about me when they wanted something from me. I didn't call Marcus in from the shed to tell him. I simply filed it away, the way you note a hairline crack in a support beam, nothing to act on yet, something to keep an eye on. And the invitations kept arriving, warmer with every phone call, until I started to feel like I was being fitted for a role I couldn't quite see the outline of. My mother's tone shifted that same week, in a way I'd known her long enough to read like weather. She called again, unprompted, sweeter than I'd heard her in years. You should bring some of your baking for the table, she said. You always were so good with your hands. I held the phone away from my ear for a second and just stared at it. In 35 years, I couldn't remember her ever complimenting me without a but attached at the end. Sure, I said. I'll bring some pies. Wonderful, she said. And Claire, it'll just be so nice to have everyone together. The whole family under one roof. Whole family, like it was some kind of favor she was extending to me, when for years I'd been the relative she quietly edited out of every group photo. I hung up and stood there in the flour-dusted light of my kitchen, feeling an old, weary alertness climb up my spine. Praise from my mother was never affection. It was a down payment. She was warming me up for something, and the timing lined up far too neatly with Renata's fishing call to be a coincidence, two of them, in a single week, suddenly fascinated by the daughter they'd spent a decade quietly dismissing. I thought about my grandmother, and something she used to say, the books always balance, if you're patient enough to wait for them to. Somebody needed something from me. I didn't know what yet, but I knew it had to be substantial, because it was big enough to make my mother compliment my hands, and that unsettled me far more than any insult ever had. Insults, I understood. It was the sudden kindness I didn't trust. A day later, my Aunt Sylvie texted out of nowhere, and it told me more about my family's inner workings than any phone call could have. So happy you finally found someone, she wrote, with a little heart emoji. Your mom says he's very handy. I read it twice. Finally found someone. I'd been married 2 years. But in the family's retelling, I hadn't gotten married, I'd finally been rescued, a phrasing that quietly turned a settled, chosen fact into a charity case. Poor Claire, saved just in time. And there it was, the machine I'd spent years staying carefully outside of. They'd been discussing me behind my back the entire time, shaping me into whatever story the moment required. Single, I was the daughter who couldn't land a partner. Married, I was the daughter who'd barely scraped one together. There was no version of my life the gossip couldn't twist into a lesson for the cousins. I typed 3 different replies to Sylvie and deleted every one. I could have corrected the record, told her I'd been married 2 years to a man I'd chosen under a canopy of apple blossoms. But I've learned that correcting gossip is like arguing with the weather, you only get soaked, and it keeps raining regardless. So I wrote back, "Thank you, Sylvie," and let it end there. Silence had always been my move, my one dependable defense against a family that turned every word I offered into ammunition. What I hadn't yet reckoned with was that silence only protects you until the exact day it stops, the day staying quietly becomes consent instead of dignity. That day was closer than I realized. It arrived, in fact, 48 hours later, carried in a plain folder by the last person I expected. My father drove out to the bakery 2 days before Christmas, something he had done exactly 0 times in the years I'd owned the place. I looked up from the register, and there he was in the doorway in his old work coat, turning his hat over in both hands like a man standing at a graveside. Customers moved around him. He didn't seem to notice any of them. "Dad," I said, surprise plain in my own voice. "Is everything all right?" He came to the counter and slid a plain folder toward me with 2 fingers, as though it weighed far more than paper should. "You should know what you're walking into," he said. That was the whole speech. No warm-up, no explanation. My father had built an entire career out of saying nothing whenever my mother was in the room, and here he was, delivering the truest sentence he'd said to me in years, at my own counter, in 9 words. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked it up. "What is this?" He looked at me, and for the first time I could remember, his eyes were wet. "It's what your mother didn't want you to see," he said. "I'm tired of watching it, Claire. I've been tired for a long time." Then he put his hat back on, told me he'd see me at dinner, and walked out to his truck before I could get another word out. I stood there in the middle of my own busy shop, a line forming at the register, a folder in my hand my own fingers didn't want to open. Whatever was inside, my father had driven 40 minutes to deliver it in person and still couldn't stay long enough to watch me read it. That told me everything about how heavy it was going to be. I waited until closing to open it. Alone in my quiet shop, ovens cooling, the winter dark pressing against the windows, I slid the papers out under the single light I'd left burning. It was financial paperwork, printed at home, ink a little faint. The first page was a home equity line of credit, taken out against the house I grew up in. The second was a loan document, a co-signature agreement, my mother's signature beside my sister's, on a mortgage for a 5-bedroom house in a subdivision on the good side of town. The third page was a bank statement, and that's the one that stopped my breath entirely. My parents had drawn a large sum from that equity line the previous spring, and a matching withdrawal had left a retirement account the very same week, both of them, according to memo lines my father had circled in pencil, funneled toward the down payment on Renata's dream house. The dates lined up like dominoes. My mother had drained her own retirement and mortgaged her paid-off home to make my sister look like she'd arrived. In the exact same season I quietly mailed the final check on land I'd built with no help from anyone at all. I sat there with those pages under my palms, and my mother's voice came drifting back across 11 years, clear as the day she said it. "We only have room to believe in one of you." It had never been about what they could afford. She'd found plenty to spend. It had only ever been about which daughter she'd already decided was worth spending it on. I sat very still, dry-eyed and steady, no storm in me at all. I folded the papers back into the envelope, slid it into my coat's inside pocket, and turned off the light. I didn't sleep much that night, though not for the reason you'd assume. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was arguing with myself over whether to do anything at all, because I could stay quiet. I was extremely good at staying quiet. I could walk into that dinner, eat the ham, admire the new house, drive home, and carry that folder to my grave, and nothing about my comfortable, hard-won life would change. That was the safe path, and I have always been a devoted fan of the safe path. But something had shifted the moment I read those numbers, and it took me until nearly dawn to name it. For 12 years, I'd told myself my silence was strength. Reading those pages, I understood it had also been the exact thing keeping the old story alive. Every time I stayed quiet, my mother got to keep selling the version where she couldn't afford to help me, where I was the risk that never paid off, where Renata was the sound investment. My silence had been co-signing the lie. Marcus found me at the kitchen table before sunrise, cold coffee and the folder in front of me. He didn't reach for it. "You don't owe them a scene," he said quietly. "But you don't owe them your silence, either." I turned that over for a long time. He was right on both counts. I decided I wouldn't storm in swinging. I wouldn't stand and deliver a speech, or ambush anyone, or torch Christmas on principle. But if they put me back on that same stage, if they used me one more time to make my sister shine brighter by comparison, I wasn't going to swallow it this year. If they pushed, I would finally tell the truth. Just once. Just the truth. I know a lot of you have carried some version of this, the family story where you're the punchline and someone else is the trophy. If you've ever built something quietly while people rolled their eyes at you, this next part is for you, so stay with me. Comment quiet builder if that's you, and hit subscribe. Christmas morning, I did what I always do when I'm bracing for something. I baked an apple pie from my own trees, and a maple pecan besides, and the ordinary rhythm of it steadied my hands the way it always has. Marcus loaded them into the truck while I got dressed, and I stood in front of the mirror longer than necessary. I wasn't dressing to impress anyone. I was dressing like a woman who owns her own building, which, it turns out, looks a lot like a good sweater and clean boots. I pulled on my coat and felt the weight of that folder settle against my ribs like a stone I'd chosen to carry on purpose. Marcus watched me from the doorway. "You good?" "I'm not going over there to win," I told him. "I'm going over there to stop losing." He nodded, because that made complete sense to him, and it made complete sense to me too. On the drive across the county, the fields lay bare and silver with frost, and I ran through the plan one final time. I would be warm. I would be gracious. I'd let my mother have her toast and my sister have her house. I would say nothing about that folder unless they forced my hand. And I promised myself that if they did force it, I would stay perfectly calm, because a loud daughter is a daughter you can dismiss, and I had no intention of being dismissed ever again. We turned onto my parents' street, past houses strung with lights, cars already lining the curb. I put the truck in park, took a breath, and reminded myself I only needed one sentence. My parents' house was decorated exactly the way it always is at Christmas, tasteful, and just a little breathless, every surface silently insisting we are doing wonderfully, in case anyone happened to be keeping score. The whole extended crowd had turned out, Aunt Sylvie and her husband, 2 sets of cousins, a great-uncle settled into the good armchair, and at the center of it all, holding court by the mantel, my sister Renata and her husband Preston. Glossy photographs were being passed hand to hand around the room, and I didn't need to look to know exactly what they were. The dream house. Renata spotted me and gave a tiny finger wave, the kind you give to hired help. Preston nodded without bothering to stand. My mother swept over, lifted the pies from my hands, and steered me into the room by the elbow. "Everyone, Claire's here," she announced, and then, in the same warm breath, still figuring things out, but she brought us her little pies. Isn't that sweet? Still figuring things out. 2 years married, 26 acres paid off in full, and to the entire assembled family I was introduced as a work in progress with a nice hobby attached. I felt Marcus go rigid beside me, and I put my hand on his arm before he could say a word. "Not yet. Not here." I smiled at the room, said, "Merry Christmas," and let my mother deposit me at the edge of things like an extra folding chair dragged up from the basement. The photographs of the house eventually reached me. I looked at them politely. 5 bedrooms, a kitchen island the size of my truck bed, a staircase clearly designed to be descended in front of an audience. I passed them along and felt the folder against my ribs. And I waited. The little jabs started before we'd even sat down to eat, small enough that objecting to any single one of them would make me look oversensitive. My mother never quite got around to introducing Marcus, just gestured vaguely in his direction once and moved on, so half the room spent the evening unsure who he actually was. Renata drifted over with her wine and looked me up and down with a smile that never once reached her eyes. "You look well," she said, in the tone you'd use with someone recovering from an illness. "Still selling muffins at the market, sweetie?" I told her we kept busy. She'd already turned to describe her new kitchen to a cousin, the island, the double ovens, the walk-in pantry, the guest suite. "So if anyone's ever in a tight spot, there's always a place to land," she added, looking directly at me as she said it, offering me, in front of the entire family, a spare room for the day my small life inevitably collapsed. Preston chimed in about the neighborhood, the good schools, the property appreciation, tossing around figures with the easy confidence of a man who's never once had to make the payment himself. I took it the way I'd taken it for years, with a small, closed smile, sipping my water, saying almost nothing. But this year, the silence felt different in my mouth. This year I had a folder against my ribs that turned every one of Preston's confident numbers into a kind of quiet joke, because I already knew exactly where the real money had come from. I watched my mother beam at her golden couple, and I thought about that drained retirement account and that newly mortgaged house, and I understood that I was the only person at that entire party who knew the true price of the show we were all watching. It made me very calm. Renata cornered me in the kitchen before dinner, and her mask slipped so fast it nearly gave me whiplash. She'd followed me in while I checked on my pies and pulled the swinging door half shut behind her, the universal gesture of someone about to say something they don't want witnessed. "So, listen," she said, and the breezy performance was gone, replaced by something tight around her eyes. "Things are a little stretched right now with the house. Preston's bonus fell through, and the mortgage is, well, it's a lot." She laughed, thin and brittle. "Mom mentioned you've actually done pretty well for yourself out there with the bakery." There it was. The fishing call, the sudden compliments, my mother's newfound warmth, all of it finally landing on the counter between us. "I was thinking," Renata went on, not quite meeting my eyes, "maybe you could help us out. Loan us something, or, invest in the house. Family helps family, right?" I stood there holding a pie server and looked at my sister, who had spent 35 years watching our mother deny me a simple co-signature, and who was now asking me to bankroll the exact house that refusal had helped finance. I didn't laugh, though part of me badly wanted to. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, keeping my voice level. The figure she named would have covered my entire first storefront twice over. "It's just temporary," she added quickly, "until things turn around." I set the pie server down. "I'll think about it," I said, the same phrase my mother had always used on me right before saying no. Renata's face relaxed, mistaking it for a yes. She had no idea I'd just decided something, and it had nothing to do with money. My mother arrived in the kitchen a minute later, and the timing was far too clean to be an accident. She'd sent Renata in first to soften me up, and now she'd come to close the deal. She picked up a serving spoon and pretended to fuss with potatoes that didn't need fussing over, working her way in sideways, the way she does everything. "Did your sister talk to you?" she asked lightly. "About the house?" I said she had. My mother nodded, still not looking at me, still rearranging food. "It would mean a lot," she said. "It's the least you could do for your sister, honestly. She has real responsibilities now, a mortgage, a family to think about. You've only got yourself and the bakery." As if the life I'd built with my own two hands were somehow smaller than the debt Renata had gladly signed up for. As if 26 acres and a marriage and 8 people's paychecks were a lesser hobby next to my sister's granite countertops. And underneath it, unmistakable, was the same old sentence wearing a new coat. 11 years ago it had been, "We only have room to believe in one of you." Tonight it was, "It's the least you could do." Same accounting. Same daughter always on the losing side of the ledger, except now that I'd quietly become solvent, I was suddenly useful. My mother finally looked up at me, her eyes carrying that soft, expectant warmth she reserves for moments she's already certain she's won. "Family takes care of family, Claire," she said. I looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," I said quietly. "I've noticed exactly how that works in this family." Something flickered across her face, a small crack of uncertainty. There and gone. She didn't know what I meant yet. She was about to. I asked Renata and my mother to step out onto the back porch with me for a moment, away from the crowd, because whatever else I am, I'm not cruel, and I wanted to give them the chance to hear my answer in private first. The cold hit hard as I pulled the door shut behind us. "I'm not going to lend you the money," I said, no anger in it, no lecture, just the fact laid down clean, the way I lay down a number on an invoice. Renata's face crumpled somewhere between shock and offense. "Are you serious?" "We're family." "We are," I agreed. "And I hope the house works out. But I'm not going to prop up a payment I can't afford to lose, on a property I have nothing to do with. And I think you already knew that, or you wouldn't have asked me in a kitchen with the door half shut." My mother's warmth vanished like someone had flipped a switch. "After everything this family has done for you," she started, and I almost admired the nerve of it. But her next words were the ones that mattered. She stepped closer, dropped her voice, and said, "Don't you dare make a scene about this at the table. Not tonight. Not in front of everyone." And there it was, the tell. My mother wasn't afraid of my no. She was afraid of what I might say if I finally stopped being quiet. Afraid of a scene, which meant that somewhere beneath all that performance, she already knew there was a scene to be made. She knew, on some level, exactly what I might be holding. We went back inside, and everyone sat down to eat. For a little while, it was almost a normal Christmas dinner, if you didn't know what was humming underneath the tablecloth. The ham came out with the potatoes, and my 2 pies sat on the sideboard like polite afterthoughts. Marcus found my hand under the table and held it, and I was grateful for him. I could feel my mother watching me from the head of the table, calculating whether her warning on the porch had landed, whether I'd stay in my lane. Renata had recovered her performance and was telling a cousin about the crown molding. Preston was carving the ham. The great-uncle had fallen asleep in his chair, plate balanced on his knee. From the outside, it looked exactly like a family. I ate a little. I said please and thank you. I complimented the ham, which was genuinely good, because whatever else is true about my mother, she has always been able to cook. The whole time, I kept my hand near my coat, draped over the back of my chair, and I felt that folder inside it, and I waited because I had decided one thing on that porch. I would not start anything. I would not be the one who picked up the knife first. But if my mother stood up and did what she always does, if she put me back on that stage one more time to make my sister shine brighter, then I was finished swallowing it. And everyone in that room was going to hear something true. My mother reached for her wine glass. She tapped it lightly with her fork, and the table went quiet as she rose to deliver her toast. I set down my own fork and folded my hands. "I just want to say," she began, "how blessed I am to have my whole family together, and I have some wonderful news to share." She paused for effect, exactly the way she always does. "Your sister and Preston have just bought their dream house." The table erupted right on cue. Sylvie clapped. The cousins made the appropriate sounds. Renata pressed a hand to her chest and did her modest little laugh. Preston lifted his glass like a man accepting an award he'd personally purchased. My mother beamed down the length of the table, drinking in every second of it. And then, because one triumph is never quite enough for her, she turned the spotlight to where she always turns it. She looked at me, warm and pitying, and said, "And of course, we're all still waiting on our Claire to figure out her life." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled around the table. Then Renata, flushed with wine and applause, twisted the knife with a smile, leaning toward me so the whole room could enjoy it. "So," she said sweetly, "when are you finally going to settle down?" There it was. The question they'd been asking me, in one form or another, for a decade, delivered this time as the punchline to my sister's victory lap, in front of every relative I had. Every face at that table turned toward me, some amused, some faintly embarrassed, all of them waiting to watch me shrink the way I always used to. I felt Marcus's hand tighten around mine. I felt the folder against the back of my chair. And I felt, for the first time in years, completely calm. I set my glass down gently, so it wouldn't make a sound, and I smiled at my sister, a real smile, because the moment had finally arrived and I found I wasn't afraid of it after all. "I already did," I said. The table waited, not yet understanding. "I already settled down," I went on, my voice quiet and level, the voice I use when I'm telling a customer the price and I know it's fair. "I just didn't invite people who never believed in me." For a second, nobody moved. Then the questions started, small and confused, and I answered them plainly, one at a time, without ever raising my voice. "This is my husband, Marcus," I said, my hand on his shoulder. "We've been married 2 years. We got married under the oldest tree on my property." My mother's smile had frozen solid. "Your property," she repeated. "My property," I said. 26 acres and a house I bought when I was 27 and finished paying off last spring. I own my bakery building outright, too. I employ 8 people and hold contracts with 3 grocery chains. I wasn't bragging. I was reciting it flat and factual, the way you'd read off a deed. I've been married for 2 years and running a business for 13, and tonight this family introduced me as someone still figuring things out. The room had gone completely, specifically silent, the particular silence that falls when a story everyone believed turns out to be wrong. Sylvie's fork hung suspended over her plate. The cousins studied their laps. Renata's mouth opened and closed twice without producing a sound. My mother stood at the head of the table, glass still in hand, staring at me as though I'd suddenly begun speaking a language she never knew I could speak. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't cried. I had simply told the truth, and in a family built on a carefully maintained story, the truth landed like a dropped plate. My mother recovered the way a fire recovers when you open a door. Her face went from white to red, and she set her glass down hard enough to slosh wine across the tablecloth. "How dare you," she said, her voice already climbing. "How dare you turn your sister's night into some performance about yourself?" The irony of the word performance, coming from the woman who had just staged her own carefully rehearsed toast, was almost too much, but I said nothing. "You've always been like this," she went on, louder now, gesturing with a shaking hand while the relatives sat frozen in place. "Selfish. Cold. You disappear for years, you don't invite your own mother to your wedding, and then you show up here to embarrass this family and make everyone feel small. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" She was crying now, the fast, furious tears I'd watched my whole life, the ones that always arrive precisely when she's losing control of a room and needs to seize it back. "After everything your father and I have done for you," she said, her voice breaking on the word done, "this is how you repay us." I let her finish. I didn't interrupt, didn't defend myself, didn't match a single decibel of it, because something had finally become clear to me that I wished I'd understood at 22. The louder she got, the smaller her argument became, and everyone at that table could see it plainly. This was the shift I hadn't known I was waiting for. For 35 years, my mother had been the calm one, and I'd been the disappointment squirming under her verdict. Now she was the one coming apart at the head of the table, and I was the one sitting still with my hands folded, and there was nothing left she could say to put the room back the way it had been. "After everything you've done for me," I repeated softly, once she'd finally run out of air. "Let's actually talk about that." I reached into my coat, drew out the folder, and set it on the table in front of me, unopened, where everyone could see it. I didn't wave it around. I simply laid it down the way you set down a card you've been holding all night. "Mom," I said, "for 12 years you've told this family a story that you couldn't afford to help me, that Renata was the responsible one and I was the risk. When I was 22, I brought you a real business plan and asked you to co-sign a loan, and you told me, and I have never once forgotten the words, that you only had room to believe in one of us." A few relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sylvie glanced at my mother. "I never asked this family for another thing after that," I went on. "I built everything I have without a single dollar from anyone at this table. And I would have kept quiet about all of it tonight, the way I always have, except that Renata asked me in that kitchen an hour ago to bail out her mortgage, and you followed her in to tell me it was the least I could do." My mother had gone very still. "So I think the family should know," I said, resting 2 fingers on the folder, "what's actually sitting inside your daughter's dream house." I told them everything. The home equity line drawn against my parents' paid-off house. The retirement account emptied the same week. The co-signature on Renata's mortgage. I told them the down payment on that 5-bedroom house had come directly out of my mother's retirement fund and my father's future, the very same spring I quietly mailed the last check on land I'd built with my own 2 hands. "You always had the money," I said, my voice never once rising. "You just spent it on the daughter you'd already decided to believe in." Renata made a small, strangled sound. Preston set down his fork. The silence that followed had real weight to it, and it was not, for once, sitting on my side of the table by accident. Here's the part I'm proudest of. I did not gloat. I had the whole table. I had the truth. I had my mother speechless for what may have been the first time in living memory, and I felt absolutely no pull to twist the knife further. Winning that way would have made me a smaller version of them, and I had worked far too hard to become someone else entirely. So I folded my hands and spoke gently to the whole room, to no one in particular. "I'm not saying this to collect a debt," I said. "Nobody here owes me money. I'm saying it because I'm done paying in silence, and silence is the only thing I've ever actually given this family." I turned to Renata, whose eyes had gone glassy. I'm not going to fund the house, I told her. But if you want real help, I'll sit down with you and go through the actual numbers honestly, without Mom in the room, and figure out whether it's even a house you can realistically keep. That's help. Writing a check just to keep a lie standing isn't. Then I looked at my mother. I didn't come here tonight to hurt you, I said, and I meant every word of it. I came to stop being the story you tell so everyone else feels chosen. I'm not that person. I never was. I just let you say I was. That's on me. And it stops now. My mother opened her mouth, and for one strange second I actually thought an apology might come out, the first of my entire life. Instead, she said, in a wounded whisper, that I'd ruined Christmas, that I'd always been jealous of my sister, that she didn't know where she'd gone wrong with me. I nodded slowly. It was, at least, honest. It was exactly who she was. I stood up, not fast, not dramatic, just the way you rise when the meal is over and it's time to go. Marcus stood with me. I looked down the length of that table at all of them, the frozen cousins, my crying mother, my sister staring at her plate, Preston suddenly fascinated by the tablecloth, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Just quiet. My father caught my eye from the far end of the table and gave me the smallest possible nod, and I understood that whatever it had cost him to drive that folder out to my shop, he didn't regret it. I nodded back. That was the entire conversation, and it said more than the last 10 years of dinners combined. The pies are on the sideboard, I said to the room, evenly. Apples from my own trees. Help yourselves. I picked up my coat, folder tucked safely back inside, and put my hand on Marcus's arm. At the doorway, I stopped and turned, because there was one more thing I wanted to leave behind, and I wanted to leave it gently. Merry Christmas, I said, looking directly at my mother when I said it. I mean that. I really do. Then we walked out into the cold, and the door closed behind us on a silence I'd waited half my life to finally hear. I didn't slow down to listen to whatever came next. For once, whatever they said about me after I left was none of my business. The days after Christmas were quieter than I expected, and stranger. Sylvie called first, 2 days later, and to my surprise, she apologized. She said she'd spent years hearing only one side of my story and had never once thought to ask for the other, and that she was ashamed of it. She asked if she could come see the farm. I said yes. 2 of my cousins drove out that week and bought bread like it was any other Saturday, except they lingered, looking around at everything I'd built, and I could see them quietly rewriting the story they'd been told. Word reached me secondhand that Renata and Preston had put the dream house back on the market before spring, because the numbers had never truly worked, and no amount of my mother's retirement savings was going to change that. I felt no satisfaction in it. It was simply gravity doing what gravity does to anything built on a bluff. My own life didn't change at all, which was, in a way, exactly the point. The oven still needed lighting at 4:15. The orchard still needed pruning. Marcus still fixed the things that came loose. The only real difference was that I no longer carried my family's story around in my chest like a stone. I'd set it down on that table, and I'd left it there. And not carrying it anymore felt like setting down a weight I'd forgotten was even heavy. My father drove out to the farm alone in January, on a grey afternoon. He stood in my kitchen turning his hat over in his hands again and finally said the thing he hadn't managed to say in 35 years. I watched her do it your whole life, he said, and I told myself it wasn't my place. That was cowardice, Claire. I should have stood up for you a long time ago. I let him say it. Then I poured him coffee and gave him the truth right back. I'm glad you finally did, I said. And I forgive you. But an apology opens a door, it doesn't move you back in. We start from here. Slowly. He nodded like a man who understood he was being given far more than he'd earned, and he stayed for an hour, and it was the best we'd had together in years. My mother took a different road entirely. She sent long messages about how hurt she was, how I'd humiliated her, how the family was fractured now, and how it was entirely my doing. She recruited 2 cousins to call on her behalf. I read the messages and didn't fight any of them. I simply stopped explaining myself the way I always had, except this time, the silence wasn't hiding anything. It was a boundary. There's a real difference between the two, and I finally understood it. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from my story, it's this: the people who never once bet on you don't get to cash in on the life you built without them. And walking out of a room with your name still fully your own is the only trophy that never depreciates. I spent 12 years believing my silence was strength, when really it was just the quietest way of agreeing with people who were wrong about me. The day I finally stopped agreeing, I didn't get louder. I just, at long last, got free. That's my story. One folder, one quiet answer, and a table that finally had to sit with the truth. If you've ever been the long shot in your own family, let this be your reminder: build it quiet, keep your books clean, and let the truth do the talking when the moment finally comes. If this reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for being here. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.